How is DT involved in teaching our deputies about new laws and case laws regarding use of force?
So we're actually heavily involved with that. I'm utilized as a use of force expert for the department. Use of force is an ever-evolving landscape. There's always case law changes and things coming in, especially in the last year and a half with some of the House bills that came in. There was a lot of training that had to take place. New hires get an extensive piece. Their very first day is just a full day of in the classroom, learning case law, policy, standards, and then in service, a couple of those hours are spent doing the same thing, just case law updates, a review on use of force policy, what is reasonable force, and any other changes in that arena.
Is there a specific case that we use to say whether an officer's use of force was reasonable or not?
The overarching case that we rely on from the Supreme Court of the United States is Graham versus Connor. From that case, it tells us that we have to look at a use of force through the eyes of another, would another officer with same or similar training experience facing like or similar circumstances respond the same or use similar judgment?
And when we watch videos and stuff, people might look at it and, Monday quarterback something. Is that something that has to be considered as well?
Yeah, that's absolutely considered, and that comes from Graham too, in that 2020 hindsight and the knowledge we gain after the fact. That may not be knowledge the officer had at the time they used force or responded with force, so we really can't take that into consideration when judging whether or not their force was reasonable. Oftentimes there is a lot more to be discovered through investigation, through interviews with both the officer and the suspect and witnesses, other camera views that might be available, other knowledge that we might gain through that full investigation.
What type of scenarios do you put your deputies through to test their skills?
So the new hire deputies, they get scenarios that are pretty simple based. Following our class, they'll go into a week where they learn patrol procedures and criminal law and all kinds of other things. So we keep them very simple, just geared at making sure they go into a scene, assess it correctly, position themselves correctly, make a correct use of force decision as to whether or not they need to use force. And not all the scenarios end in force. Some scenarios, such as some of our mental health scenarios, if they do the steps properly, they can end the scene without ever having to use force. For the veteran deputies at in-service, the scenes can be a little bit more complex. We'll start working in concepts of whether or not they can enter a room without a warrant, because they have that knowledge from working more years on the road, and they have more of that case law knowledge when it comes to search and seizure.
Is there anything new that we're teaching based on the law changes from 2021?
With the new changes in law, the real emphasis on de-escalation, we've made an emphasis to our patrol deputies to really slow down, wait for backup, kind of make a good tactical plan before going in. What that leads to is a lot more of our use of forces involve multiple deputies. So that has led us to focus in our in-service on those team tactics and how do our deputies work together and not against each other to take someone down to the ground, get them under control, get them restrained as quickly and as safely as possible.
Why are we using takedowns and control techniques that might hurt or cause people pain rather than just handcuffing them when they're standing up?
A standing suspect that's able to kick and punch and swing arms around and reach for weapons and things like that can only add to escalate a scene to where now we have to use a higher level of force. The techniques that you're seeing where we're using pain compliance or control holds, while those do cause a little bit of temporary pain, they're a lot less injurious than some of those higher levels of force like a baton strike. And the courts as a whole see those things, taser, baton, pepper spray, they see those things as a higher level of force, where those control tactics, just those hands-on tactics, are seen as a lower level of force.
What are some of the dangers of the use of force?
When we have to go hands-on, there's always dangers. There's dangers that it can get out of hand and escalate into something worse. There's dangers that the suspect becomes injured, that we become injured. So it's a dangerous situation for everybody. It's also a very unpredictable situation. We never know exactly what the suspect is going to do. And quite honestly, even when we have a plan of what we're going to try to control the suspect, that can change very quickly. And then we have to play catch up and make these split-second decisions under these tense and uncertain circumstances that are ever evolving. It's a really imperfect situation, which is why when we ask our deputies to use a reasonable amount of force, that's a realistic ask. We just want them to do something that is reasonable, that gets the situation under control, and then once it is under control, they stop using force.
The last thing I want to ask you is, why is it when a suspect gets a hold of one of our weapons, like our baton or taser, it could potentially be a deadly force encounter, but when we use those same tools, it's considered a lower level of force?
Good question, Darren, and I'm glad you said potential, because it's not every time. Just because a suspect gets a hold of one of our weapons, that doesn't automatically jump us to deadly force, because we're looking at the totality of the circumstances of each individual case. The simpler answer is, in our hands, those tools can be effective at controlling somebody, and there's a legal expectation that once we have you under control with those tools, we will stop or de-escalate down to those lower levels of force. If a suspect gets a hold of my tools and my weapons, that causes a lot of problems. Number one, they don't have that same legal expectation. There's no expectation that they're going to stop using that weapon. Several of those weapons you mentioned, especially in the case of a taser, those could fully incapacitate me if I was shot with those. I carry other weapons on my belt as well, such as a firearm. If I'm incapacitated and can no longer defend my firearm, and my ability to keep that goes away, that becomes a very dangerous and very grave situation for me as a deputy.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Jason. I hope that everybody at home learned something today. So there you have it. That's some of our basic principles on use of force and defensive tactics training program from the expert himself, Sergeant Jason Youngman.